General Hooda, welcome to this program for Strategic News International. And I'm particularly interested in looking at what is the way forward for the Indian Army, particularly, and the Indian military in general, in the plans for restructuring and resizing the force to keep it battle ready. What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, See, Nitin, we are living in times of stressed defense budgets, and that's a reality. I think it's also quite clear at this stage that any major substantial increase in defense budget is unlikely. And rightly so for many reasons, but if India as a country is spending 1% of its GDP on health only, then to expect major increases in defense budget is unlikely.
True.
And how it's impacting the army particularly is, the pace of modernization has almost completely slowed down. We've heard the vice chief saying that 68% of equipment which is in the army is in the vintage category.
Sure.
So, Nitin, to me there are two options, two major options. Is we carry on the way it is,
Right.
and accept that modernization is going to get hit. And it's not as if we are not living with this for the past many years. The army is doing an outstanding job, and in CI ops is doing an outstanding job on along the borders. But the long-term impact is, I think, going to be debilitating because our modernization for future war fighting is going to get severely impacted.
Right.
So therefore, the second option is you trade off some manpower for modernization. That is, you trade off size, for a better shape of the army.
Yeah.
And today, I think with the advent of technology, better practices, even logistic capability that is out and available in the civil sector, I think we can modernize. We can have a more capable army, but a leaner force. So I think that's the second option is the way that the army particularly should be looking at.
Yes, and in at a time when you were army commander, I think this has been under discussion in the army from, if I remember correctly, from 2010 onwards, where there were studies done for restructuring, resizing, and there have been multiple studies currently undergoing or perhaps about to get completed. Those studies notwithstanding, the challenge for India is, I think, that we have live borders. There we have two strong adversaries, and at the same time, we have an internal security situation. In that context, to balance the need for need for a standing army or a big standing army, and modern army which has got technology, which has got future technology and all that, will be a difficult task for any leadership. No matter what you do, you can't keep people happy. So, in that context, do you think an Israeli model or a South Korean model where you have reservists who serve for 2 3 months a year and are ready if necessary, and take that money out, which you mentioned in your first answer, for getting future technologies would be a better option?
Yeah. So, within my sort of my recommendations would be that we look at three, four areas. The first area is technology,
Right.
because with much more advanced weaponry now becoming available. So, for example, the army is looking at transforming its complete artillery force from 105 mm, which was the mainstay, to 155.
True.
So you have a gun which is much more capable. You have a gun which is of a longer range. So do we still need the same numbers as earlier?
Right.
I'll give you one more small example. For example, air defense weapon system. If you're getting weapon systems with longer ranges, with a higher kill probability, then you need the same number of units.
True.
That's where I think some places where technology can interface and help you reduce your manpower size. The second area you mentioned is reservists. So I'm not sure we can apply the same concept as is there in the US or Israel, but I still feel there is some scope,
Yeah.
particularly in peacetime units, without impacting on units which are on the borders or along the LC.
Right.
Is some selective application of reservists possible?
Mm-hmm.
Very large number of soldiers retiring every year.
Right.
They are fairly young.
Mm-hmm.
They have been trained in the army system. So can we use those people and they have a reserve liability? Can we use a part of them, to reduce the size of the standing army is something that we could look at. General Rawat is talking about a leaner battle group concept.
Right.
That's one area.
Mm-hmm.
Another area, Nitin, I think we should seriously look at is, joint force structures.
Okay.
Uh, you have to look at both the army and the air force.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have, sort of common capability. Can that be optimized? Attack hepters, air defense, helicopters, UAVs,
Sure.
joint training. Are these some areas where we can look at some optimization? Because currently you see both the army and the air force is fielding almost the same type of equipment.
Duplication happens across the board. Yeah. Mhm.
And one more area, Nathan, where I think we need to coordinate a little more is between the army and this, central police forces like the ITBP and BSF.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you take the China border,
Right.
you have both the army as well as the ITBP deployed there. They are working under different ministries. Each is raising its own forces. So I think that's also one area where if we can look at, how we can sort out the command control, for example,
Right.
have a little more integrated approach.
Mm-hmm.
Then this, raisings that are going on, I think even in those areas, we can look at some
Yes.
kind of
I,
optimization.
I think that's a great idea. But looking at just the Air Force and the Army, do you think the approach for integration or more integration should be bottom up or top down?
See, I think it'll have to be top down, Nitin. We are seeing problems. I mean, let's not get away from it.
Right.
We are seeing there are issues. We saw, the sort of problems that were there over who's going to man the attack vectors, for example. And then you have the Air Force buying some, and then you have the Army buying some.
Sure.
So these are areas I think similarly with air defense, uh, helicopter training, for example. I mean, why should we have different schools
Correct.
for the same type of equipment?
Sure.
So I think it'll have to be top driven.
Yes.
Once we get the joint structures, I think our move towards integrated formations, greater jointness in war fighting capability,
Right.
that will also, speed up in
Save
case.
some money also in that context then. But if since you commanded Northern Command for more than 2 years, and one of the live problems there is the CICT, which dominates the thinking and the mind space, perhaps. Correct me if I'm wrong. In that context, we can't reduce numbers there, isn't it? But is the answer, does the answer lie in giving more flexible role to Rashtriya Rifles there, which was perhaps one time was thought in Northern Command?
Yeah, sure. Because we should not look at Rashtra Rifles merely for a counterinsurgency operations, although that is its primary responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is such a potent force,
Right.
and for its integration, although it has been done in our operational plans,
Right.
provides you enormous capability. more than 60 battalions,
Sure.
and so therefore, I think what's required is a certain amount of reorientation. Some kind of regular training
Mm-hmm.
where if you really want to integrate them into your operational plan,
Right.
that will help. I know it's a challenge because being completely deployed in city operations, pulling out for training is not difficult. But I think slowly we'll have to start gearing up towards that.
Giving them dual role and at least orienting them towards dual role will
Some of
be
it will be done. You see, because large number of units are today also on the line of control and counter infiltration duties.
right.
Yet their integration with conventional, units which are on the LCs is much better.
Right.
But even those in the hinterland, we need to start looking at how we can do some training at least and orientation for
That's
operation group.
Yeah. So that brings me to these the studies that the Army headquarters has ordered and the Army commanders are studying. I mean, just from an outsider's perspective rather. One of the things that are easy to do, it seems at least, is to reduce the manpower in the headquarters, the command headquarters, the Army headquarters, and merge some of those directorates. Will that have any substantive impact, or do you think it's just a cosmetic change that will have occur?
No, no, I think, you see, it will have an effect because our problem in units is the availability of officers. And these headquarters are largely, staffed uh, by officers. So the availability of officers is going to improve.
Right.
And I think, you see, if you have a leaner sort of army headquarter, I
Hmm.
think one big advantage is the bureaucracy reduces. If you have too many directorates and too many guys, duplicating the same work. So I
Yes.
think it's good. I think the efficiency at the army headquarter level will certainly increase.
Right. But there is the other points flagged by many people, maybe the critiques of this, change that is being sought to be brought in, is that just the Indian Army doing the restructuring and resizing will not be sufficient. It has to be across the board in the three services, or at least with the Air Force, because the Army and the Air Force work much more closely together. And unless they also restructure and resize, it is done. Unless it is done simultaneously, it may not be of any use as far as the army restructuring is concerned. Is that something that one should look at a little more closely?
It is, I wish it had been a defense services restructuring. Unfortunately, it is not because, the army is under enormous pressure because of the budget.
Right.
Therefore, the army has to resize. But as I said earlier, surely we need to look at the Air Force because the army and the Air Force work so closely together.
Yeah.
So joint structures, common equipment areas, common, sort of units. Uh, can we do joint training? I think it's a key area with the Air Force that we need to look at. The other area we need to look at is defense civilians, Nitin,
Sure.
because there is often a criticism that the army, which is, as you also mentioned, so heavily committed in CICT operations, so heavily committed on the borders,
Mhm.
and this is the organization that is being targeted for reduction,
Correct.
while you know uh, civil defense civilians, MES, ordnance
Yes.
factories who are not the most efficient,
I know, and they're 6 lakh in numbers apparently.
yeah, are carrying on the way it is. So I think there is a need to have a hard look also at
Sure.
defense civilians.
I think a comprehensive look is what is needed. And I don't know, I mean, you will know better because you may be studying it a little more closely than we do. But any restructuring or resizing should be part of a larger national security strategy is something a given. But is that happening in your view?
So that's a big criticism that actually it should be driven by what is our national strategy,
Yeah,
and that should define your force structure. Uh,
right.
and obviously that is the right approach.
Hmm.
But frankly, Nitin, since it's not happening, should we therefore say, we are not going to restructure? I think the army is fairly clear on what its responsibilities are, both during peace and war.
Sure.
Uh, and often, may not be right, but often the army has to take the worst case scenario,
Right. Right.
so that you're prepared for all kind of contingencies.
Hmm.
And therefore, I think there is enough basis for the army to look at a future warfighting role and carry out restructuring. If the national security strategy would have been there, it may have given some added sort of emphasis.
Sure.
I think it would have also helped uh, in getting the government and the army clearly on the same page, which is something that the army will now have to sort of tackle. That these are our plans, and debate and discuss it extensively.
That's true. I hear that there would be, I mean, some national security strategies being authored or being finalized. So hopefully that will happen, and the army will be part of that study or that restructuring that will happen. But the other criticism that I've heard from finance people and people who have a bit of a knowledge on the management of inventory in the forces, not just in the army, but particularly in the army, is about, let's say, the stocking of ammunition. I mean, the old standards of 40 days ammunition, or more than 40 days of ammunition, is perhaps exaggerated. But as you said, army takes in the worst case scenario. Is there a way to balance between the two extremes and maybe reduce that inventory and save some costs there?
There is, there is enough, there is scope. I mean, so we are planning on each and every man of the Indian Army, going into battle and then catering for 40 days of ammunition, for him, for each gun,
Yes.
for each individual. So I think there is scope. And from what I am aware, the Army headquarters is seriously looking at this and, getting to some practical figures.
Right.
The other problem with 40 days is the kind of infrastructure that is required to be built up
Exactly.
to stock these, is enormous and immense. So
Correct.
we're going to be able to build that kind of infrastructure to stock so much ammunition. So I think it's an exercise that they're undertaking. But I'll say not only ammunition. I think we have to seriously look at all other.
Stocking. All
Yeah,
other stocking.
yeah,
Yeah.
because the availability of items in the civil is quite a lot now.
Right.
So we still don't. There are items we are stocking for one year, so it's a little excessive. So I think this whole stocking level needs to be looked at.
A restructuring, yes.
Yeah, yeah. And it'll help in two ways. One is the inventory carrying cost is almost 10% of your cost of the inventory. So that's huge every year, adding to your revenue.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then the manpower requirements to look after so much inventory. So
Mm.
that's something that needs to be looked
I
at.
think from what I remember, couple of years in the last couple of years, they've also segregated the core, non-core items, and they're sourcing it from open market now. The smaller items like socks, belts, berets, all that, which also is saving some cost because otherwise OFB and others were adding to the cost and selling it to the army. I think that's one good step that has happened.
Yeah, yeah.
So one final thought on this, and maybe you would want to share, is the uh, the requirement for the army to be more to have more technologically qualified officers and men, because as compared to the Air Force and the Navy, they are much, I would say, the percentage of people who are technologically much more attuned to what the modern warfare requires is much less in the army than the other two services, given the nature of our deployment. But do you think going in the future we will require more technologically qualified and technologically equipped both men and officers in the Indian Army, which will also mean adding to the manpower cost, perhaps?
I don't think it'll add too much to the manpower cost. You know, you can raise educational standards. You
Right.
can have training, sort of within the army. I think we have no option because if you're going to go in for better technology equipment, if you're going to look at how future wars are going to be fought, and people are talking about artificial intelligence and cyber and robotics, I think there is no option, but to have more technically skilled people in the army.
Right, both in the officer cadre and the men. I think. So that is how. So it seems that the thought process is correct. We are on the right track in the Indian Army on doing what is being thought about. But I think perhaps the pace, the period in which the restructuring should happen, and also the congruence with the other two services needs to be on the same page. Is that what we can sum up as far as the restructuring, resizing is concerned?
Yeah. So the 2 points you made are correct, and I'll just add one more.
Right.
Uh, as far as the pace is concerned, what you talked about, I think we should not hurry up too much. We are
Right.
looking at major restructuring changes.
Mm-hmm.
So as the chief said, let's test bed them.
Yeah.
Try them out, for a couple of years. If it succeeds, then you will need to, start writing up doctrines and tactics and strategy of how to use this new force.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think we should give it maybe a 4 or 5 year period for the complete restructuring to be done. You rightly pointed out, with the Air Force, we need to coordinate. But I'll say also what is going to be critical is
Mm-hmm.
government, is taken on board.
Yes.
If the government is going to look at it merely as a number saving exercise and not look at corresponding capability building in terms of, new technology developments, new
Right.
organizations, money available for new weapon systems to be introduced,
Right.
then I think, we'll end up with a smaller army, but,
Not
lesser capable than what it is today.
and not ready for the future wars.
Yeah.
That could be a double whammy, actually.
Yeah. So the government has to be, sort of taken on board, and
Right.
here we are carrying out reduction in manpower, but correspondingly, please ensure that the capability that is required is also built up. So, there'll need to be some dedicated funds, dedicated budgets.
Yes.
In the short term, you may not find a major saving, but I think ultimately in the long run you will. So I think it's very important that the government and the army get together and study this together,
Right.
uh, and then find mutual acceptance.
I
That I
think.
think is the key.
Yes, I think the assurance has to come from the government that whatever money is saved by cutting numbers or cutting manpower will be plowed back into the army for capability building. I think that's the bottom line
Yeah,
as
yeah.
far as this is concerned. But thank you very much, General Huda. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and you always have great insights to share. Thank you very much for this, and we will keep coming back to you for further discussions and chats like this.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.